A lot of my childhood was spent in the area of New Haven, Connecticut. I was fascinated by the four-track main line and the complicated infrastructure with electric locomotives collecting power from overhead wires with pantographs. My HO scale layout is set in the fictional town of Eastport between Stratford and Bridgeport. I wanted to try to reproduce the excitement of watching fast trains on a big main line under wire. My layout shows the New Haven Railroad in the late 1960s and Penn Central, Amtrak, and Conrail up to 1980. Today, this part of the corridor in Connecticut sees many Amtrak trains, the occasional Providence and Worcester night freight, and numerous commuter trains of Metro North. It's a challenge to accurately model the infrastructure unique to the New Haven main line. Model Memories makes wonderful bridges like the one seen here, which was originally painted black, but I felt that my soldering skills were insufficient to build them well and quickly. I compromised by using Märklin catenary, more of a Euro prototype, but I felt adaptable to something convincing as experimental catenary. So next I'll give you an accelerated version of the early months building the layout. It began on a 6-foot board in early 2019. And that board was in my office. As you can see, there's 4 pieces of Woodland Scenics roadbed glued down using Gorilla Glue, which worked surprisingly well. I was feeling my way along, having not built a layout in many years. All the construction, all the scenery, of which I've never done any before this, and I was happy how a lot of it worked out. The catenary masts are measured in very carefully and penciled in with the exact rectangle, and each one of them are numbered, as is the board. Number 8 Atlas switches are put in to really measure well where the interlocking, the crossovers are. The major issue, though, with Atlas track, of which I'd collected a great deal over the 20 years prior to building this layout, is that because it makes it easier for them to go together quickly and be assembled, the last 2 ties on each end of each piece of track are very fake looking. So if you want to improve the look of the Atlas track, you have to clip off those 2 ties at the end of every one, and then slip some, once you've joined up the tracks, you slip some loose ties which have been painstakingly, tediously filed to have a little gutter that will fit in the rail joiners. But once you do it, what a vast improvement in the appearance. And the Code 100 Atlas, it's about the size of the rails on the Northeast Corridor, so it really wasn't out of line. The X here marks where the tower, the classic New Haven Railroad pagoda roof tower, will go once I've built that. There are 2 crossovers here on each side instead of a full interlocking, just for space. And at this point I couldn't resist running a couple of locomotives just to get a feel for what 6 feet of this layout would look like, with so much left to do. So at the very beginning here. Now the catenary masts that I chose to use are the Märklin, which are manufactured in a green color that I was not going to use, but there's a clip there that I also wanted to get rid of. It's meant to clip right onto Märklin M track, but as you see, I clipped those right off. And also there's a tiny nut that you can loosen there at the bottom so that you can swivel the foot around to point any direction, which was definitely needed. There's a bunch of those on the left in the original green color, but against the brown rock, the ballast on the New Haven tracks that I was going to use, it looks much better in black, which was how the New Haven metal was painted anyway, except at the bottom of these there's a block which is actually a concrete block, so I painted those concrete color. Here's a little glimpse of what's to come, just a little test there with Metroliners. And I had never done any scenery ever on my 2 previous layouts. So here is some 3M double-sided tape where we're going to start off putting some weeds in. Put some Woodland Scenics ground cover on, of which I'm using several different types. Just sort of sprinkle it on there and then push it very tightly against those adhesive strips. That's a kind of a planned layout of where those are going to go. There's gaps where the catenary masts were going to go. All of them numbered, but before the fun of doing the ballasting, there is another tedious thing that really improves the realistic appearance of track, which in the real world is never all shiny. So you have to use a marker or a paintbrush to paint dark brown all the sides of the track. Only the tops of the rails can be shiny if you want it to look a little closer to the real world. You put the ballast on, you brush it very carefully, you spray on some adhesive, which I'll show you that in a moment. What the adhesive is, there are still holes here, gaps, and what those are for is to put the actual catenary masts in there. You can see those concrete looking bottoms and the black metal parts. Again, a little look at what's going to be on here when it's all finished up. I use Gorilla Glue, which surprisingly worked well enough to seat the metal bottom there. I had to then use the spine of a tank car here to position them perfectly for the center line of the track for the wire to be hung on. And at this point, they're loosely glued on. I later decided I had to go back in and put some screws in a lot of these to tighten them down because I bumped one with my elbow. It wasn't so good. Anyway, the original plan then was that I put in some loose ballast, which you can see is lighter color because it hasn't been sprayed yet with adhesive. And here is that adhesive, Scenic Cement, Woodland Scenics, a little spray bottle after I've sprayed it. And then once you dry it overnight, hey, it's starting to look like something here. What we don't have yet is wires, and that's the next part. Märklin made wires up till 2004 that were of sheet metal, which are not as thin and prototypical looking, but they're extremely easy to use, and you can improve the appearance. They don't show up well in the natural metal color, especially against that brown ballast. So I used I think a New York Central green paint to simulate on these dozens and dozens and dozens of catenary wire sections to make it look like oxide, copper oxide green. And so here's the first batch of those. This was another really tedious, lengthy thing to do, but I had hopes that the result would be good once you see it above the ballast. And here's the first few sections that I clipped on, again staged with some trains just to see what it looks like. And it looked good enough to me to be going on with. And now we're starting to really get that urban infrastructure look to these tracks, and I found that really exciting. So at this point, this is what I would have loved to have in my teens, was an actual electric locomotive operating under wire. So that was a huge little milestone. Now here we go. To make that happen, we've got to expand it to the full layout size. That 6-foot board is screwed down to a 3x6-foot benchwork made of 1x3s. And we screw in another 3x6 benchwork and another board on top. Glue down again some roadbed, which is much easier this time because there's no switches on this part of the main line. Got to put those ties in again. It's very, very, very laborious to do that, but the result I think is better. Put in some unpainted wires just to test everything. And here was the result. The first read on using that corrosion colored wire. This close in, it's not quite the good result that I actually saw with my own eyes, but you'll see a photo or two of that. And it ended up working exceptionally well, more so than I hoped. Now we're working on the back of the layout, and the great layout designer John Armstrong wrote that one of the major reasons why people lose interest in their layout or it just gets abandoned is that they didn't build in enough storage for trains, locomotives, cars, staging tracks, and so forth. So the trick now in the front part of the benchwork that I just attached was going to be to get around the corner to the back at the same time as expanding from 4 tracks to 16. Each track would have 4 storage tracks. I'm not a DCC guy, not yet anyway. I collected a lot of old equipment over the years, so the wires amazingly worked the first time. And there is a real New Haven Railroad relic, which in a second part of this video I'll show you. Now the catenary is another layer of complexity, and I had previously done some tests to see what is the smallest radius you can use for straight pieces of catenary, and I determined it was 24 at the very, very smallest, but obviously a wider curve looks better, and so plotting out a 37-inch radius outside curve as it heads toward a tunnel that'll cover the transition behind the backdrop, it looks very, very nice compared to the tighter radius And there on the left front is all the roadbed in place, and I'm still working on putting it into the staging. Look at that green wire. That's what I'm talking about. And when all the scenery comes in, it'll be better. Now, this hugely complicated track, we're getting around a corner. You're going to draw it on paper. You're going to lay it out and try to estimate where everything's going to go. But it really took days of working on this with all these curved switches to to make a workable transition. Lots of testing to get around the corner, as it was putting these straight sections of catenary in around the curves. So that's a look at 3/4 of the layout, main level. Now lots of testing. So now I'm in the home stretch for the first level of the layout. Along the left side of the central access hole will be a full-length backdrop, and so the visible part with scenery will be 3 by 20 feet. My golden spike moment came several months in when all 4 tracks were connected up and powered, and for the first time, 4 trains ran at once. Building a layout is all about delayed gratification, and reaching these milestones is very satisfying. There was so much yet to do, and that's what the future parts of this video will cover. See you again soon. Thanks.